All right, so our next topic is on quadratics. Quadratics are different types of equations. We have not seen graphs like this before. They're when you have the U-shaped graphs that we've kind of been typing into our calculators, or like the frowny face, or like rainbow-shaped graphs. So those are what quadratics are. So today we're going to talk about what are the main features of a quadratic graph. It is pretty much all vocabulary, so all you have to do is memorize the vocabulary. So first of all, we know all graphs have a y-intercept. We know the y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis. So right here at this dot, that's going to be our y-intercept. We know we write those answers. The y-intercept is always 0, comma number in parentheses. We also know that graphs have x-intercepts, and it's where it crosses the x-axis. Now on this graph, we have 2 x-intercepts because it touches the x-axis twice. Okay, and we know when we write those, you write them as number, comma 0. But it also has other names. When we're talking about a quadratic, they could say different words that still mean x-intercepts. So solutions, roots, zeros, those are all words that still mean the x-intercept. So I'm going to go ahead and circle on the graph. Oh, geez. And red. Those are our x-intercepts. There are 2 of them, and you write them number, comma 0. They are the solutions, roots, and zeros. They all mean the same thing. I'm also going to go ahead and circle the y-intercept. Was right there. Okay, great. The next one we're going to talk about is the point where the graph turns. So either the very bottom of the graph, or if it's a rainbow-shaped graph, then it would be at the top. That's called the vertex. That is the turning point of the graph. So I'm going to circle that in green. Right here. That's our, that's not a, there we go. Green. That is our vertex. That's our turning point. So to describe our turning point, they want to know, is that the minimum or maximum of the graph? So the minimum would be if your vertex is at the bottom of the graph, because that would be the lowest point. That's what minimum means. Maximum is if this vertex is at the top of the graph, because it is a frowny face. So we can draw a little picture. So minimum is when it's a U shape. Maximum is when it's the frowny face. Okay. And the last real main vocabulary word we need to know is the axis of symmetry, which you may or may not have seen on our practice star test. But the axis of symmetry is the line that goes through the middle of the graph. So in our graph, it's this dotted line. It cuts the graph in half. Can I draw it straight? Beautiful. Okay. And the equation of that, because they're going to ask you, what's the equation of the axis of symmetry? It's always x equals some number, because we know vertical lines are x equals equations. Okay. So you would just say, oh, x equals whatever number the line goes through. And that would be your equation for axis of symmetry. Okay, the last thing we got to talk about is domain and range. First of all, we know that the domain is talking about the x numbers in the graph. We know that's what domain means. And in these quadratic graphs, since the x numbers, we have an arrow on one side, that means it goes forever, and an arrow on the other side, that means it goes forever. We know that means the domain is going to be all real numbers, because it goes on forever in the x direction. In the y direction, for range, we know range means y. It depends which way your graph is pointing. If your graph is pointing up, then that means your range is going to be greater than or equal to whatever the y number at the bottom of the graph is. If it's pointing up, then that means it's greater than. If the graph is pointing down, it would be down, so that means we would use the less than symbol, less than whatever number is up there. Okay, so we're going to go through some examples and like figure out what are all the vocabulary words in the picture. So the first one, they already give you a graph. First question they want you to know is, what is the vertex? So I know the vertex, if I looked back at my notes, the vertex is the turning point. So I know that's going to be right there. What are the coordinates? It's going to be -1, comma, +1, right there. Okay. Basic question, what is the y-intercept? We know that's where it crosses the y, and in this graph it crosses the y right here at +2. We know y-intercept, we do 0, comma, number. it is important you don't put the 2 first. For x-intercept, we know that's where it crosses the x-axis. On this graph, does the U-shape go through the x-axis right there? No, it's not touching it at all. That is possible in these graphs that it does not touch because it's strictly above the x-axis. So we're going to say there are no or none x-intercepts. So if you're doing any of the practice and it asks you what the x-intercept is and it does not touch the x, then you're going to write none for x-intercept. The next one says zeros. We know 0 was one of our words that just means x-intercept. So I'm going to put x-intercept next to that. So whatever I just said was the x-intercept, we know 0 is the same thing. So if there were no x-intercept, then there's also none for zeros. Okay, next one is they want to know, is it a minimum or a maximum? Now they're talking about the vertex when they're talking about minimum or maximum. So my vertex was down here. Is that the lowest or the highest point? Well, this is at the bottom of the graph, so that means it's a minimum. Great. Next question was, what is the axis of symmetry? So that's where I'm drawing the line through the middle of the graph. I can tell that that line's going to go boop, right there through the middle. Hopefully you would use a straight line on go formative. But for axis of symmetry, it's always going to start x equals some number. Well, what number does it equal? Well, what x number did it go through right there? -1. The next question wants to know, what is the domain? We know the domain is always, for these graphs, all real numbers. So that's all I got to write. And I would type this out, all real numbers. Okay. For range, we know that the range means the y. I just got to figure out, is it y greater than or less than? So I see my graph up here is pointing up. That means it's got to be greater than or equal to. So that symbol we know is this way, greater than or equal to. Greater than or equal to what number? Well, what is the y number at the bottom down here? Right there, that's a +1. So y greater than or equal to +1. If that went too fast for you, make sure you rewind and watch it again if there was anything that you did not catch in there. Another way they could ask it is if they're just giving you the equation. So what would we do with this equation we've been practicing is that we're going to take this equation, we're going to type this in Desmos. Okay. So I'm going to type it in. -2x squared minus 16x minus 30. Here we go. F of x equals -2x squared minus 16x minus 30. Ooh, that's 20. 30. Okay, so here's my graph. I'm still going to do all the same things that I just did using the graph that's in the calculator. So the first question was, what is the vertex? We know the vertex is the turning point up there. And on Desmos, if you click on it, it will tell you what the point is up there. In this one, it's -4, 2. I just need to know that that's what I'm supposed to be putting for vertex. So vertex, it just told us was -4, 2. Okay, my y-intercept, we know the y-intercept is where it crosses the y. So I have to zoom out because I can't see. I don't see it touching the y-axis, so I gotta zoom out. Zoom, zoom, zoom. There, you see there's a dot on there, and I click it, and it tells me it's 0, -30. So we're gonna write that down. 0, -30. Okay, the next one was x-intercept. We know that's where it crosses the x. And in the last graph, it didn't touch the x, but in this graph, it does. And it tells me what numbers it touches. So since I zoomed out a lot, I'm going to click the home button. That's going to take me back to normal numbers. So on mine, one of the numbers was -5 and 0. And the other one was -3 and 0. So that's what I got to write. When you type this in formative, some of them ask you to write one at a time, and some of them ask you to write them together. So if you're writing them together, This is how it should look, with parentheses and a comma in the middle and then parentheses again. Make sure you would type no spaces in there. So that was x-intercept. Zeros, we know 0 is the same thing as x-intercept. So whatever I just wrote for x-intercept, that's what I write again for 0. They mean the same thing. It's just a different word. Okay. Maximum or minimum. So I'm looking at, what does my graph look like? This point up there, is that at the top of the graph or the bottom? And this one, it's at the top because this is the frowny face. So if that's at the top, then that means that is the maximum. So we're going to write that down, maximum. Okay, the axis of symmetry, we know that's the line that goes through the middle of the graph. So that cuts the graph in half. So that would be going through here. Now I can't draw it on this graph, obviously, but I know it would be going right there. And what number would it be going through? The x number right there, -4. So we're right, the axis of symmetry, we know that starts out x equals some number. We just figured out the -4 number. Last two, domain and range. Domain we know is the x number. And we know from our notes that since it's going to be arrow on the left and arrow on the right, that means it's going to be all real numbers for domain. For range, well, I know that range is the y, so I'm going to write y. I have to figure out, is it pointing up or down? Well, this graph, obviously on Desmos, they don't put the arrow, but the line keeps, like, the graph keeps going down and down and down and down. You could scroll forever down. So that means those are arrows going down. So that means if the arrows are going down, that means it's going to be less than or equal to. Less than, we know the symbol looks like an L. So less than or equal to what number? Well, what was the y number at the top of the graph up there? Well, it said something. The y number was a 2. So then I put a 2. Okay. If you have any questions about how to do any of these things, or if you're answering them in formative and you think that you're right and you don't understand why formative is telling you it's wrong, make sure you're sending a message. Otherwise, you can go ahead and get started.